source of new recruits to them is having a huge impact on their abilities. So.
Yeah, thank you, Deputy. I suppose from the Naval Service Reserve point of view, we've been on an operational basis been putting people on Naval Service vessels for years now as an integral part of the crews on board. In fact, during the boom times, there were times when naval vessels could not have put to sea except that Naval Service Reserve provided enough personnel to make up a safe number of crew. In addition to that, we have in the past provided safety boats for regattas and other maritime events. But I suppose, just to address your point there on using unemployed people, what mainly comes to mind is the kind of new direction for Naval Reserve that the Flag Officer Commanding Naval Service, Commodore Mark Mellett, has pointed us in. And that has us interacting with the University of Limerick and the industrial output. Essentially, what the way we are going forward is that we have been directed to get involved with the underwater robotics section of University of Limerick with the view to developing of new technologies that will in turn then aid the push to use our maritime resources. So it's an integral part of kind of the renewable resource push for the maritime section. So we are to get involved with them and help them develop their technologies. Another aspect that we're dealing with, we have talked with Mr. Sean Cullen of the Geological Survey of Ireland. They're tasked with carrying out the detailed surveying of the seabed, amongst other things. So one of the things we've discussed with them is that they have a lot of equipment vis-a-vis sonar scanning equipment and boats. So they have the equipment, but not necessarily personnel, whereas we have the personnel, or certainly we had an establishment of 400, it was reduced to 200 by the VFM. So for an island nation, we could fit the entire Naval Reserve into this one room here. But certainly, looking at that Geological Survey of Ireland, we could potentially take their equipment and train our Naval Service Reserve personnel to use their equipment in a partnership with them. And then we could use at the weekends and for week-long training periods that equipment to carry out these detailed seabed surveys in coastal waters, in estuaries, Shannon estuaries, Cork Harbour, Dublin Harbour, to the benefit of the state. And also, you're then training these people to carry out such activities, and you're giving them experience, and you're giving them a trade effectively. So, just I suppose that is just where we're aiming at the moment, and that is a potential use of the NSR for the training of unemployed people, as you alluded to.
I might invite Mr. Patrick Mully, given his civilian position, if he might address the issue on the unemployment.
Chairman and deputies, the situation that we have, we approached the Minister 2 years ago when the internships came up. And what we were looking at was our own RDF people who were unemployed at that stage. And that number has grown tremendously since. One of the problems that we encountered, which I'd like to just adjust what the Minister said this morning in regard to recruitment, the RDF and the NSR never experienced a problem with recruitment. We were restricted. There's an embargo in place since 2008, and in 2007 the then Minister allowed us 700 recruits and the military allowed us 172. So it's not from recruiting people or getting people in that we find ourselves in the situation that we're in today. However, one of the aspects that we looked at in quite some detail in the RDFRA 2 years ago was the TOOS programme, which was coming on stream at the time, and the internship programme, which was coming on stream. And we would still say and contend that people who are serving and have a number of years service in the RDF would be ideal candidates for an internship programme with the Defence Forces. Now, my last inquiry to the department was that they were looking at this quite actively, but we said that, you know, it's a source where people could be utilised, and again, if the people around the country, the youth of the country certainly could be taken up on those type of schemes, we would welcome that, and we would feel that it will enhance our training then again. It will give us another leg up on the training, and if we are going to have the same capability as the PDF, we would envisage that down the road, if this programme works well, we should arrive at a situation in 3 years' time when the local sergeant major is looking for somebody to do a duty, and he can ring up some RDF person and say, are you available for Wednesday? Yes or no? and he can be brought in for the duty. The same as penny stores would use their part-time people. There's no point in looking at this in a sort of a regimented fashion and say, you can't, you can't, you can't. We need to think outside the box. We need to have flexibility in the system. And we need the Defence Forces at this point in time, as my colleague said there earlier, to embrace the difference that is the RDF, because we've embraced the difference that is the PDF since we began. And there are differences, but these differences can be exploited to the benefit of the state, the benefit of the PDF, and certainly to the benefit of the people of the country.
Okay, thank you. Anybody else want to come in on questions?
Yeah, Chair,
Right, welcome.
I'm filling in for Deputy McLaughlin, who's at another engagement. But he did ask me to raise two questions, so if I can put them. One is the impact of the cuts over the last number of years. I think it's gone from 13 million budget in 2006 down to around a budget of 4 million last year. And if you could just, quantify how that has actually been implemented across the RDF. And the other one is just in relation to the value for money report itself. There is one part of it that suggests that of the 4,544 members, only 2,010 of them, it's about 60%, avail of required training to avail of gratuities. And he wants to know, would you agree with those figures contained in the value for money report? And why, if there's any particular reason, there was such a high number of personnel who didn't avail of that scheme? Is there a particular reason behind that? And also he asked me to ask in relation to the RDF, the cuts in the numbers of members of dedicated support staff from the PDF, how is that actually affecting?
Okay, number of questions there.
I might direct the first question to Patrick Mully.
Just on the budget there, the budget figures were that in 2008, the Minister was asked this morning as well, in 2008 the budget was something running like 23 million for the PDF side of it. One of the other things is that the actual payments to RDF people are now being reduced down to 2.5 million. On the availability to train, we need to correct what the Minister said this morning. Nobody, under no circumstances, are paid gratuity unless they have completed a set criteria of training. And that criteria of training is that they have to have 48 voluntary hours in the year, they must have fired their annual range practice, and they must also complete 1 week's full-time training in order to qualify for the gratuity. Gratuity was never paid to people who didn't train. That's absolutely not true, and it's something that needs to be corrected. On the numbers of people that are available for training, when the big cuts, if you like, came in 2008, we enjoyed 66,000 man days. That's the allocation given to the RDF. And those number of man days were halved. We were brought down to 33,000. So the arithmetic is quite simple. If you have 66,000 one year, you can't bring the same number of people to camp the following year. And we experienced the same thing through the 80s, when the number of man days were reduced, and we had about 15,000 people in the FCA at the time, and then we couldn't bring those people to camp. So it's not quite fair to say that if you cut the number of man days from 66,000 to 33, that you're going to have the same number of people attending training. You can't have it because they're not available. It's not available for them to take up. On the budget that was allocated, the CRE, which was referred to this morning in the Minister's statement there, they reported back in December 2011, and they claimed in the CRE that they had fulfilled McCarthy, which was to reduce the numbers in the RDF by 2/3. So this is December 2011 now. So they had claimed that they reduced the numbers by 2/3. So again, you can see we didn't have any hand, act or part in reducing the numbers. Those numbers and reductions were forced upon us. They also went on to claim in the CRE report that they had reduced the budget of the RDF by 5.8 million euros. Again, we had no hand, act nor part in that, and that was something that we suffered. So that's the impact that we're looking at here. In the numbers, there's been an attrition, and we have lost, in the last 5 years, 16% of our numbers year on year, every year. We also had a question raised by Deputy Stanton this morning on the number of people who were non-effective. And the non-effectives run, which is surprising, at 9% per annum. Now, if some number runs at the same percentage year on year, that's a policy. So obviously, whether it's a declared policy or an undeclared policy, there was a policy to have the attrition of numbers imposed on us. Now, we have no problem with that, but it was basically, we were suffering death by 1,000 cuts. And it's unfair that there's reference made in the VFM to people not turning up for training when there was no training available. There's no point in saying that you can train, but we're going to halve the number of days, we're going to reduce your numbers. If they reduce the numbers, which they did, how can we train? There's no point in saying you can turn up 4,000 people when there's not 4,000 people left in it. Now, the numbers have stood up, and the number of people that we have turning up for training have stood up under all those cuts. So the impact is that we would look now and see that the reorganisation is talking in terms of 4,000. And the reason they raised it to 4,000 from what they term the effective strength, i.e. the people that turn up for paid training in camp, to 4,000 is welcome, and we welcome that. And the payment for that, if you like, or the Secretary of the Department this morning indicated that we were now in a position that we were going to have 41,500 man days allocated to us in this year. And that's fine, we have no problem with that, we welcome that. And that would basically replace the amount of finance which was expended on what we had as a gratuity. So they're the parameters that we're working within. We're just taking it on the chin, if you like, and we would certainly see that it's unfair, it's very unfair to say that we haven't got the numbers turning up when the numbers have been reduced by the department and by the military.
The case of personnel not being willing to train, is the case of the capacity is just not there to train the numbers that you would like to train.
Sorry, Deputy. As I said, the figures speak for themselves, and they're not my figures, they're the figures that we've got from the department.
Might I address the Deputy on just two of the points you raised? And just following on from what my colleague said, in the VFM itself, it identified the effective strength of the reserve at 95% in 2006 and at 87% in 2011. A volunteer organisation with people giving up their own time. Mostly, the vast majority of it is unpaid and receiving no compensation for it. And 87% of a volunteer organisation is effective. In relation to gratuity, this again is an example of an inflexible system putting restrictions on reservists. So it's saying that I think in 2011 only it gives figures 61% availing of paid mandates. In order to get gratuity, as my colleague said, you had to complete 8 field days, 8 training nights, your annual personal weapons test, and at least 1 week of full-time training. I had an individual in my unit who had 17 field days, 2 weeks of full-time training, his annual personal weapons test, and he had 7 parade nights, so he was 1 short. And he did not get his gratuity because he was 1 night short. The inflexibility in even recognising the hour sum, if you total up the hours, it's far in excess of what he was required to do under the minimum. And 1 night, 2 hours, but he had done 17 Sundays and he didn't get his gratuity. So he doesn't come in within those figures. So this is a completely flawed analysis of how we do it. I'll give you another example. I was based in Mullingar, and Mullingar was closed. My unit and my offices were closed in February 2012, and there was no alternative location provided for my troops to train. I had a platoon there. And there was no alternative location provided until September. So I had a situation where I had personnel who had to satisfy certain training criteria to obtain their gratuity. Yet the state had implemented a position where we couldn't attain it. If someone was coming to me in a civilian capacity, I'd be saying, well, we'll be bringing judicial review. There's a case of legitimate expectation here, and you've actually put in place a system where we can't obtain it. In employment terms, it'd be constructive dismissal. So that'd be the point I'd say in relation to the findings of the VFM review in looking at that.
Could I just ask a question on that, if I may intervene for a moment? Sorry. That's the way it was in the past. But looking into the future now, what will the requirements be now in order to actually get full-time, in order to get the 7 days or 14 days training? And I know the grant is gone, but will people still have to turn up for these training sessions as you've outlined?
Yes, again, the system has been put in place. In the first year, there's a reduced requirement because obviously the reorganisation, it had to take place, and the 1st of April was the kick-off date for the new units. So in the first year, personnel will be required to do 32 hours of unpaid training, one week of full-time training, and 4 hours of experiential training, which is further unpaid training, which is called experiential. And I'm kind of going, well, what's the difference between that and the other 32 hours? But it seems to be that they can call you in whenever they want, for whatever they want. The second year it'll be 48 hours with 8 hours of experiential training, and the third year will be 48 hours with 12 hours experiential training. So if you have around to me and says, I want you to come in next week on Monday and Tuesday and do your 12 hours of experiential training, and I say, I can't physically do that because I have meetings and work, or my child is ill, or I've used up my annual leave, then I can't meet my requirement. So you put in place a system that if it's inflexible and isn't used in consultation with the reservists, I can't meet my requirement. Moving on from that point, the reduction of the permanent staff, the biggest cost attached to the reserves historically was the permanent defence forces administering the reserve. The loss of the permanent defence forces to the reserve will be a huge loss. Those personnel had significant experience of us. They understood how we worked. We understood the restrictions. They understood the restrictions on us on a daily basis. Now we're put into a permanent unit. They work full-time with fellow professional soldiers who, a lot of whom have never had experience of the reserve. They don't understand the restrictions on us. And they're being asked to do this in addition to their other duties. So now this thing is, we're an imposition upon them. We've been imposed upon them. They're not getting anything extra for it. They don't know us. They don't know our capabilities. After the VFM review, I'm surprised I can breathe unassisted. And, you know, this is what they're seeing, and they're getting that imposed upon them. So absolutely it's a loss. It's a loss for everyone.
Okay. Any other questions here? Just one for myself. What will the role of the Naval Reserve be in the new reorg?
I might pass that to Mr. Owen Colgan or Mr. Shane Morris.
Thanks, Chairman. Well, it's kind of, as I outlined previous, it is, the way the Flag Officer has is aiming for is a more technologically advanced Naval Service Reserve. An example of this, just to give an example, was last week we had 16 members of the Limerick unit, including myself, volunteered for a oil pollution exercise in Shannon Estuary, which involved both unmanned aerial vehicles and unmanned autonomous underwater vehicles operating off the Eliorla and the Irish Light ship Ronya Whale. So it kind of led on from our involvement in UL, and so that will be an introduction for us for the operations of ROVs, remotely operated vehicles. Again, as I said earlier, for the use of kind of port control reasons and for scanning of seabeds, hydrological surveys and that type of thing. So as well as on top of that, the roles been carrying out for the last 15 years of supplementing the naval vessels, sending younger members like Shane. I might ask Shane to outline to you what his experiences are out to sea and various other maritime activities around the coast, such as regattas and other kind of other activities. Say the Waterford unit does a lot of searches on behalf of the Guard Síochána and what have you. But I'll just hand over to Shane Morris, who might outline more what he does in the ships when he goes in the ships.
Yeah, going to sea with the Naval Service Reserve, with permanent Naval Service, it's only at the moment suitable for the junior ranks of the Naval Service Reserve, you know, ordinary seaman, naval seaman, up to leading seaman as well. We hopefully that'll, you know, include other roles for the senior members in time to come. From my own experience, you're going out there as a seaman, you're doing the same roles as the seaman on the Naval Service ships. It's, you know, we see as ourselves as doing the job in parity with the Permanent Defence Forces, and it's not recognised as that, and we're hoping that that'll be recognised going into the future as well. In my own experience, in one of the patrols I was on, up to 15% of the crew was reserve. So it reflects what we were doing at sea with the naval service, and I hope that will continue into the future and that our role will be recognised further.
Okay, thank you very much. Just the civil defence is costing less than the reserve, and yet the numbers are both on a par. Why is that, I wonder? What's any reasons why that may be the case?
I think my first observation on that is if you give the example of the civil defence, an instructor in the civil defence gets €19.95 for 2 hours of instruction. As of 31st of August last year, on a personal basis, I had 136 voluntary hours outside of paid training, and I had another 2 months left in the year. So I would have been significantly better off in the civil defence if I'd been getting my €20 for my 2 hours. In respect to budgets, we wouldn't agree with that, and I'd ask Patrick Mully to deal with that.
I'll actually hand you over to Owen Colgan there, Chair, because he's more au fait with the budgetary.
Yeah, thanks, Chairman. I'm drawing this answer from, as an engineer, I was the Major Emergency Management Officer for Galway City Council for 3.5 years. I've been in the local authority system for 5 years. You have to remember that civil defence have a full-time civil defence officer in every county. So that's a cost that clocks up, a significant amount of money every year, plus also all their equipment and then their pay and what have you. What I'd like to, when we're discussing the issue of the civil defence, there's 2 items or 3 items I want to bring to the attention of the committee. Number one is the civil defence have grown quite a lot recently in the last number of years since 9/11 in their budgets. I think pre the IMF coming into town, they were about €5 million a year was their budget. But the IMF, or the civil defence and the other, like the Coast Guard, which have 1,000 members, they carry out very good functions in response to major emergencies and to local kind of requests and incidents in an aid to civil authority. But 2 things about them. One, what they do, the RDF can do. We also can respond to these kind of floods and gorse fires and items like that and weather incidents. But on top of that, we can raise our response to a superior level in that we are also an armed service. So we can be armed as well if that's required. And the second thing I'd like to bring to the committee's attention is the fact that civil defence and the Coast Guard and these voluntary organisations, they don't have the same contractual obligations as the RDF have. I.e., if a crisis, a national crisis or major emergency goes on for, say, over a week or 2, what you'll find is the civil defence and the Coast Guard guys, although they get some sort of subsistence pay, it won't be enough to pay their mortgage or feed their kids, and they'll eventually have to go home. Whereas we are contractually obliged, we have enlisted, and if the Minister sees fit to mobilise us full-time, then we are mobilised full-time at the service of the state, and subject to military law. We can't go home, we're there. That's a risk we take personally as reservists. Financially, it could prove quite costly to us, but that is the advantage of the RDF over these other organisations such as Civil Defence and the Coast Guard. We are on the hook more or less. We can be mobilised full-time to the full disposal of the state.
Okay. Just 1 or 2 more questions if I can. I note there from the review that you cannot perform armed duties in aid to the civil power. Could you comment on that? Is there a restriction about performing armed duties in aid to the civil power? That's been discontinued, according to the...
I'll direct that to Patrick Mully.
We are now prohibited by the law to respond to aid to the civil power. And they're looking at the legislation to allow us to respond to aid to the civil authority. That legislation was first enacted back in 1976, where the Criminal Law Jurisdiction Act came out, and we were allowed to be mobilised, and we were in fact mobilised right through the 70s up in the border and other places as well. And that was a retrograde step in one of the amendments that came along in 2007. We would feel that there is no need for it to be there whatsoever. There is no cognitive difference whatsoever between an RDF person and a PDF person as regards to the training and the type of training. It was demonstrated before. In fact, if you look at the historical side of it, in 1972, we actually had something in the region of 274 people up on full-time security duty, and that lasted for over 2.5 years. So again, as we said in the 1999 report, we haven't changed, our cognitive abilities haven't changed, and our volunteerism hasn't changed. And basically what we're saying today is that we could provide services for the state through the PDF and augment those services at a vastly reduced rate. As regards I suppose your question is that we don't see that impediment should be there at all. There is no reasonable explanation as to why it should be.
Which you're saying is being looked at in understanding.
They're looking at the military people have informed us that they're looking at changes in the legislation to allow us to respond in aid to the civil authority. Now, the excuse that they gave us in the bad weather scenarios in the last number of years was that there would be a cost factor involved by calling us out, and we would absolutely refute that.
Are you also saying you can't be called out under law at the moment?
I would take it. We can indeed. The minister can activate us any time he wishes. Yeah.
And security duties have been discontinued.
The security duties were discontinued. We weren't given a reason or an explanation as to why they were discontinued, but we take it that it was the advent of the security duty allowance for the Permanent Defence Forces.
But the value from the report has something to do with the 24-hour commitment.
We would still do security duties when we're on camp. So a security duty on camp and a security duty when you're not on camp are the same thing. So, you know, it's a bit of a grey area as far as the military are concerned, in that you have absolute authority to do them when you're on camp, because they would tell you that you're on training, so you can do them. And then when it comes to a regimental duty, as we might call it in the barrack, we're not allowed to do those.
You make very interesting points regarding the specialists, the doctors, the electricians and so on, who may actually have skills that would be of use to the military when they don't have them themselves. I mean, that's something I think certainly we should be pursuing and looking at, and I think there's an interest there, certainly in that.
We would have a broad range of skills right across the board, and it's not just in the professions, but we have all the skills of the trades as well. And again, we had, if you can recall the last big storm they had in the UK, we had quite a number of people in the RDF, in the ESB and in Aircom who actually travelled to the UK to repair their infrastructure, and they were all RDF members.
But finally, could you comment on the single force proposal structure that's being developed as part of this? Is that going to be a big advantage to you, or a disadvantage, or something you welcome?
Personally, I welcome it, and I think that it's a great move forward. And if we can, you know, get the culture shift that we require, in that Martin was outlining a while ago that we're being parachuted in on top of regular units now, who had never anything to do with us. And again, as I said earlier myself, we embrace the difference and see it as a positive. They don't embrace the difference and they see it as a deficit. And that's one of the huge things that we'll have to overcome, and maybe in time it will work out, because it certainly did work out in the 70s and we had no problem with it.
Mr. Chairman, if I might, just on the civilian skills, I think it is something that no comprehensive review of the Reserve Defence Force has ever been completed to identify the range of skills. And I think in us coming here today and requesting that such a review take place, that is something that would be fundamental, is to identify the skill sets, the qualifications and the experience. Because by doing that, you identify your assets, you do a stock take on what you have, you identify what you have, and then you decide on how you can use it. So that is one of the key steps we would say that would have to happen in such a review.
I think we could recommend to the Minister to have a look at it. It would be a simple enough operation to do. Mr. Kiley, do you want to...
Just on that point, the Minister did say this morning that he would have a look at it in around 12 months' time. We'd urge the committee here to maybe have a look at it sooner, in light of the fact that we can bring the skill sets to the Minister at any time. You know, he did say this morning that he'd look at it in 12 months. We'd prefer if we would look at it before the end of the year, with perhaps with your own backing in that.
Maybe we can reflect on that and discuss it a little bit later and see what we decide.
I'm sorry, could I just answer? Deputy O'Farrell said there a while ago about the helping out with communities and all of that, and helping out with the youth and that. I think that as a Reserve Defence Forces, we'd absolutely be delighted to do that, but unfortunately we're constrained by the military authorities. But certainly, if there was a mindset or a change set there, there's no problem at all from the Reserve Defence Forces helping out in any of these things.
The problem has been over the years, and Deputy O'Farrell is right here, is to identify ongoing operational requirements from the force. And that's still a difficulty. You say you have some ideas and suggestions there, and maybe we could invite you to send them to us maybe in the near future, and we can have a look at those again and maybe have another discussion on that. But I think the ongoing operational requirements is something that has been mentioned in the development report as being an issue. And again, I know from my own experience over the years that you train, but there's nothing to do. So I mean, and then people after a while begin to get a bit disillusioned.
Say that you were talking about training and that. Well, the Naval Service Reserve in Waterford, they constantly help the civil authorities and with body searches and shore searches and all that, along with the officially along with the civil defence.
So there may be areas that
there are
back to us.
huge areas.
Yeah, if you go back to us with that, because it's not here, that would be quite welcome. Specific areas where you feel I think that would be useful to have that discussion.
All may I add, all voluntary, may I add.
Okay, I want to thank you for your attendance here today and your very interesting contributions on this very important matter, and it will be ongoing, I can assure you, for members here. So we're going to go into private session now to deal with some housekeeping matters. Agreed? Agreed.